The Sony FX30 is the best camera you can get for sports videography in 2024 for about 90% of people. Let me explain. Hey everyone, my name is Matthias and I'm a local sports photographer and videographer based out of Orlando, Florida, and today I'm going to tell you why I love the Sony FX30 and why I think it is the best camera for about 90% of sports videographers. So first in background, I've been following this camera since the day it was released, and the day it was released I basically knew that I wanted it. I've had the camera for about the past 8 months now, and I've also been shooting sports photography and videography for about the same amount of time, and let me just tell you, this camera is absolutely amazing. So let me just give you guys some background information that I think will help put this into context more. So recently I've been interviewing for a lot of sports photography and videography roles, and what I've noticed is for sports videography is for the companies, for the universities, for the professional teams that work in the professional field, many of the cameras that they use are from Sony cinema line. Specifically, they like to use the Sony FX3, Sony FX6, and now the Sony FX30. So this is one of the cameras that is commonly used for those professional sports teams, for the universities, and just for professional shoots all across the industry. So I just wanted to start with that because I feel like it provides much context into why this camera is valued so highly and why people rave about it. Now, let me get into more of my personal experiences and what I've learned from using this camera and why I personally like it so much. So first off, the price. The price of the Sony FX30 is amazing. I believe it is currently at $1,800, which is an amazing price for what it gives you. This camera essentially is a mini Sony FX3. It has all of the same features, the same layout, the same body, basically exactly the same as Sony FX30 with two changes. Those changes being that this camera is crop sensor or ASPC, and the other being that it doesn't have a 12,800 ISO. So those two changes, are significant, I feel like they don't make that much of a difference when it comes to sports videography. Specifically, if you're someone who shoots outdoors or shoots those big field sports. Of course, having the Sony FX3's 12,800 ISO is incredibly helpful, especially when shooting indoors, but I feel like we can do without that feature, and this camera essentially has that at a much lower price. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Sony FX3, let me just read off my favorite features that the Sony FX3 has that are shared with the Sony FX30. The FX30, for the price, you get a camera that has 4K 60 with no crop, 4K 120 with crop, two SD card slots, a tilting screen, body with quarter 20 screws, a big body unlike most other APS-C cameras, the Sony picture profile, so the Sony Cine profile. There are many more features, of course, that the Sony FX30 and FX3 share, but those are some of the main ones I wanted to highlight, especially for sports videography. So for the price, you get all of those amazing features, and honestly, 95% of the features that the FX3 have that the people look for when buying the FX3. So now that I've told you the pricing and the features that the Sony FX30 has, let me just bring up something that people always like to mention about the Sony FX30 and that is important to know, which is that it is a crop sensor camera or APS-C camera. Essentially what that means is it is not a full frame camera. So when you put full frame lenses on this camera, it will be cropped in an additional 1.6 times. Now, some people like to say this is a negative, but I personally see it as a huge positive, especially for sports videography. The reason for that is one, we get a much larger range of lenses, being all of Sony's APS-C lenses or crop sensor lenses, and also being able to use all of the full frame lenses. Because our FX30 can use both of these lenses, we simply have a much wider range to pick from when it comes to lenses. We have those cheaper crop sensor lenses, but then we can also get those premium lenses and put them on our FX30, like a G Master or like the Sony 7200 f2.8. We have basically a full range of lenses we can use that are Sony or Sony compatible. The other positive about having a crop sensor camera is that we get an additional crop when shooting. So if you grab a full frame lens and you put it on the Sony FX30, it essentially will be cropped in 1.6 times. The reason I like that is because, as most of you know, when you're shooting sports videography, you're not right up close with the action most of the time. Imagine you're at a field sports game, something like football, soccer, lacrosse, something where you have a huge field and you can't get that close. Having that additional 1.6 crop with a full frame lens guarantees you to get closer to the action while still getting that crystal clear, crisp shot. So I personally see the crop sensor as a huge positive, especially for someone like me who likes to shoot field sports like soccer and football. Now, another reason I love the Sony FX30 is for all of the cinema features that are included in it because it is part of Sony's cinema line. So as I mentioned, the standard for most videographers or most professionals who work in the sports industry that I've noticed that use Sony tends to be the Sony FX6, Sony FX3, and now many are leaning towards the Sony FX30 as well. The reason for that is because it gets all of Sony's cine features, which I personally love. Something else that is a great feature about the Sony FX30 is its ability to be rigged out. So because it's part of Sony's cinema line, we were able to rig it out and, as I mentioned, connect an XLR handle, getting a top handle, a side handle, putting your monitor on, putting your professional audio on. Just being able to fully rig it out like a big professional cinema camera is another huge feature that I love about the Sony FX30. And then one of the last ones that I didn't know if I was going to be using so much just because I wasn't familiar with it before getting the Sony FX30 was zebras, peaking, anamorphic squeeze, shutter angle, and also proxies. So those features are great. The ones that I've mainly been using are focus peaking and zebras. So I don't know if a lot of you are familiar with zebras, but zebras essentially help you point out when a shot is overexposed. And then focus peaking just outlines your subject to show you what is in focus and what is not in focus. Those two have been huge when shooting sports videography because, as I mentioned, when you're in that moment, you don't want to miss any shot. You don't really have an opportunity to redo a scene or a situation. So ensuring that you're in focus and your exposure is correct is a huge win and a great feature that the FX30 does have. So overall, the Sony FX30 is an amazing camera and it will be great for any person who wants to get into sports videographer, whether that's a professional, whether that's a beginner, whether that's someone who's somewhere in between. This camera will be amazing and it'll be very great for you to use. I personally have been applying to a lot of internships for professional sports teams here in Orlando and also universities. And one thing that I've begun to notice is that they're beginning to use the FX30 a lot more, because having a Sony FX30 at $1,800 is better because you can get more of them and have more coverage versus just having a few FX3s or even fewer FX6s. So this camera is amazing for the price, for the quality, for the features it gives you. Overall, I just love using it. The FX30 is an amazing camera and it's really elevated my workflow and my videos. This camera was easy to get started with. It was at a lower price and it provides all those professional features that I could ever think of and want to use. If you guys like this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments you want to leave me, please leave them down below. I do reply to every question and comment and try to talk and interact with as many of you as possible. If you have any questions or want to talk to me personally, please feel free to shoot me a DM on Instagram, which I'll leave a link down below. I'll also leave some links to where you can get the Sony FX3 and also some of the setups that I use when shooting sports videography. But one last thing I did want to mention is that this camera actually allowed me to get into my first ever professional sports game, which I will leave a link to a video right here. In that video, I'll teach you how to get your own sports credentials so you can go and shoot your own professional sports games. But that's it for me today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.